Hi everybody, this video is called Common Misconceptions About Greek, and what I want to do is talk about some things that are generally misunderstood about Greek or about biblical languages in general that many of us catch based on how Greek is conventionally used in sermons and other Christian teaching, Christian books, and in some cases things that are repeated by people who aren't super familiar with the language. And so what I'm going to do is just name some of these misconceptions and then talk about why they're misconceptions. In some cases, you may have taught some of these things, or you may have embodied some of the things I'm suggesting not to do. I have as well, so I don't want anyone to feel bad as a result of this video, but I do want to help us to use Greek as responsibly and accurately as we can as Christian teachers who stand in a position of authority oftentimes and teach languages that we may not be as familiar with as you would think we ought to be able to stand there and teach it authoritatively. So I'm just going to go through a number of things and talk about them a little bit, and hopefully it will be helpful for you in your use of Greek in the future. So the first misconception is it's often repeated that Greek is a very specific language. Now there may be ways in which Greek is specific, but actually what you'll find the more you get very familiar with Greek and translation, the more you realize it's actually very, very ambiguous. And so there's quite a lot of things. When you read the Bible in English, someone has made quite a lot of decisions about ambiguities in the Greek text that we take for granted if we're always reading in English. We take it as, okay, that says what it says, that's what the text says. Oftentimes there are a lot of alternative possibilities, and someone who's well informed and knows more oftentimes than we do has made those decisions, so we might trust those decisions, but we need to recognize that lots of decisions are being made for us. The text is not as precise as some people like to think. And when someone has a view where the Bible is perfect and an extremely high view of inerrancy and things like this, the tendency is to want to say we know exactly what the text means because Greek is a specific language. And whoever started saying that, I don't know who they were, but I can tell you they didn't know very much about Greek. You could say the same thing about Hebrew. These are languages that have a lot of ambiguity, and as people who are not native speakers of these languages, it's all the more difficult to be completely sure how people would have heard what the Greek and Hebrew texts said. And for that matter, we find that actually, if you look at church fathers and so forth, a lot of native Greek speakers disagreed about certain passages. So even to a native speaker, a lot of this is not obvious. And so we need to just appreciate that language is ambiguous. Greek is very ambiguous, and that's a reality. And so that's one of the reasons we learn Greek, so that we don't have to rely on the subjective choices that are made on our behalf by translators. Oh, and here's the slide where I was supposed to say all that. Anyway, one other point to make here that I didn't say yet is all translation is interpretation. So again, someone has to make decisions about what they think is the most likely intention of the author, or however you want to decide what a text means. What's the most likely way to interpret this text, or the best and strongest way to interpret this text? There's no such thing as just translating perfectly from one language to another. That doesn't happen. Also, one of the implications is that knowing the Greek does not guarantee knowing the meaning. So a lot of times I think people employ Greek in Bible teaching and Bible interpretation as though the fact that they know Greek means they know what the text really says. And though Greek can help us discern what the text really says, it's absolutely not justified to say, well, the Greek word means this, therefore I know for sure what this text means, because the fact of the matter is there's a lot of ambiguity, there's a lot of various possibilities, and ultimately as interpreters of Scripture, we need to do quite a lot of things, learn about historical context, cultural context, yes, get familiar with the biblical languages, and also pray and seek the guidance of the Holy Spirit if we want to really be faithful interpreters of Scripture. Knowing the Greek text is not an open and shut argument for what it means. Okay, so the second misconception I want to talk about is the idea that a good Bible translation is quote unquote closer to the Greek, and people use this a lot when they want to say, well, I use this translation, it's closer to the Greek. And again, these are people who really unfortunately don't know what they're talking about. I've probably said that at some point in my life too, so I don't mean to judge anyone else harshly, but here's the issue. So again, because all translation falls on a spectrum between what we call literal equivalence on the one hand and functional equivalence on the other. Literal equivalence is this idea that you're translating what the grammar, you're translating closer to a word-by-word translation. What does the grammar convey? What is literally being said? Functional equivalence, on the other hand, has to do with trying to translate what you think the text means to communicate. And that's not always going to be the same thing as what it literally says. So translations that communicate or strive to communicate the intention of the text rather than specifically what does the grammar literally say would include the New Living Translation, the New Revised Standard Version and the Revised Standard Version, and the Common English Bible most recently. Those are translations that are farther on the functional equivalence end of the spectrum. Translations that are farther on the literal equivalence end of the spectrum, that are more close to the grammar, or at least make that claim, are the New American Standard Bible and the English Standard Version, I think is what ESV means. Those are some examples of translations people would cite as being closer to the Greek. Now, the fact of the matter is, a truly literal translation would be very strange and very misleading because Greek words don't fit together in the same order as English words. There's idioms that would sound completely incomprehensible to a native speaker of English, but to a Greek-speaking person would make sense, just like, I don't know, I have an example off the top of my head, but there's lots of things we say in English or any other language that if you translate it word by word doesn't make any sense. So there's no translation that is, if you're reading English and it's comprehensible English, it makes sense in English, it's not a literal translation. Choices have been made, interpretation has been done, that's unavoidable. So there's no purely literal equivalence translation. And so for this reason, following the grammar closely may distort the meaning of a text. So what people talk about being close to the Greek as though it's a good thing, oftentimes being close to the Greek literally will actually make the text more misleading or give you a sense that it says something it was never intended to say. And in a different video, I'll talk about grammatical gender, where we'll see that a masculine plural noun in Greek, if someone wants to say they're being closer to the Greek, they're usually going to translate that in the masculine. So if it's like adelphoi is the masculine plural of brother, if someone translates that brothers, that implies in English it sounds like a group of male siblings, whether that's metaphorical or literal. Whereas in Greek, if you're talking about a group of male and female siblings, brothers and sisters, you would use the same word, adelphoi, the masculine plural. So it's not necessarily clear just by seeing that word on the page whether a group of men or a group of men and women are included. And so to translate it in the masculine is closer to the Greek, but may actually artificially distort the Greek text, or the meaning of the Greek text, and do so in a way that potentially will make women feel excluded, at least at a certain implied level, or even if that's not, even if people appreciate that they're included, even if it says that, it's at least a slightly misleading way to render the Greek. So all that to say, no translation captures the Greek perfectly. A more literal translation is not necessarily better, and so we need to be realistic about what translations are going to do for us, and really think about, what do I want my translation, if I'm going to pick a translation to use in English, what do I care about? Is it, what's the translation methodology? How did they make the decisions they make? Who made the decisions? Were they qualified to make the decisions? So on and so forth. And also, frankly, you might consider the audience. Like if you're using a particular translation at church, you might have reason to use a different translation than you would privately for whatever reason that might be. So we shouldn't just assume that being closer to the Greek is preferable. I don't think that it really is. Okay, the next misconception I want to talk about is called the etymology myth. Etymology is a word's history, and particularly the parts that make it up. So the word compassion in English comes from the Latin for the com part means with, and passion means to suffer. And so if you have compassion, the idea is you're, at least in terms of the word's origin, the idea is that you're suffering with someone. However, when we use that word, we're not necessarily thinking about that etymology. I don't necessarily mean that I'm suffering with someone whenever I say the word compassion. And so we want to be careful about assuming that where the word came from reflects what it means in a particular instance of its usage. So the etymology myth says that the meaning of a word comes from its etymology. One of the common ways that you hear this used in Christian preaching is people will talk about the Greek word for church, which is ekklesia. And ekklesia etymologically comes from ek, which is a preposition meaning out of or out, and kletos, which is called. And so people will say, okay, out and called means called out, and so the church, the ekklesia, is the community of called out ones, and that's what that word means. The problem is that doesn't, just because that's how the word is put together, that doesn't mean that's what people mean when they use the word. Just like compassion, we aren't always thinking about suffering when we say that. So ekklesia was already a word used in the culture before the Bible was written, before the New Testament texts were composed, and so it had a particular meaning. That meaning may have morphed a little bit more in its use to mean church. It's something like an assembly. So it doesn't necessarily mean the community of called out ones. That's not a fair interpretation. And if maybe some of you have used that in preaching, I'm not trying to make you feel bad, but now you know better. And so I hope that you won't use that in the future. So how do we decide what a word means if it's not from etymology? The meaning of a word comes from its contexts, and there's a lot of contexts for a given instance of a given word. So the usage of the word, how is it, like I said, a great example would be the word butterfly. When I say the word butterfly, think about what you imagine. What you probably don't imagine is butter. And you may not imagine a fly. You probably imagine the animal a butterfly. I don't know which kind of butterfly you picture, but probably you're not thinking about butter. I believe that, from what I can tell, that is where the word comes from. People seem to have thought at one point that flies, I don't know if they laid their eggs in butter or something like that, but that's not what we don't consider the etymology at all when we use that word. And so what you want to look at to understand an instance of the word butterfly is, how do people use this word? That's very different from the etymology, at least a lot of the time. You also can look at the grammar of a sentence. So individual words are not all that matter. Words have meaning within sentences. They have meaning within, there's specific forms, like a plural versus a singular, a past tense versus a present tense, and things like that. There's also the surrounding words, phrases, and so forth. All of that shapes what a word means, and so you can't just figure out the meaning of a word by looking it up in a lexicon or a dictionary or something like that. Word studies in general only go so far. And then there's the cotext. The cotext is what has already been said. So if I'm in the 3rd chapter of John, verse 15, the cotext is the first 2 chapters and the first 14 verses of chapter 3 of John. So what has been said up to a certain instance of a word is going to shape what that word means when it occurs. And in fact, in some cases, you might consider what comes later as well. But most especially, cotext is what has been said so far, and especially what has just been said most recently. There's also the author's typical use of that word. So it turns out that if you look up a word like grace, this is going to have a different righteousness or something like that. This word is going to mean something different when John uses it versus when Paul uses it, or you can pick whatever comparison you want along those lines. So before we think about the general meaning, or at least before we decide what a word means based on its general meaning, we want to look at how does Paul use righteousness? He uses it in a very distinctive way. What does it mean when Jesus talks about the kingdom in a particular gospel. You're going to get a little bit different answer depending on which book you're reading. And so you want to consider the author's use of a given word, not just the general use. Or it's not that words have some grand, perfect meaning floating out there in space somewhere, right? How does this author use this word? That should influence how we hear it. There's also the structure of the text. So texts have a shape. They have an organization normally. That's going to shape what we interpret specific words and phrases and sentences to mean. How do they fit in with what else is going on? There's the discourse. So what is the author responding to? Especially when we are looking at letters, we should take into account the fact that we're hearing one side of a two-way conversation. If Paul, for example, writes a letter, he's writing in response to something. We don't always know what that is, but insofar as we can understand what he's responding to, and in general, when we're talking about language at all, that's a very big part of what language means. And then there's the cultural contexts. So if we're reading the New Testament, we need to think about what Jewish culture in Palestine in the first century and thereabouts was like. We want to look at if we're reading something that applies to a Greco-Roman context, we want to take that into account as well. There's quite a lot there, and we can't know everything fully, and frankly the texts, we don't have enough sources to know everything we'd like to know. But cultural contexts are a big part of where meaning comes from, and so it's important that we not only study words and phrases and languages and so forth, but that we also study cultural context to shape what we think is a reasonable thing someone might say, or what a particular phrase means, or just in general, what's being said and what would it mean to its hearers. And then also the fact that we're in the Bible in particular talking about a religious context or several religious contexts. There's shared assumptions between Paul and Timothy, let's say, that wouldn't be true if Paul was writing to the Roman emperor or something like that. So there's multiple cultural contexts and other kinds of social contexts we can talk about. That's also going to influence where meaning comes from. And so for this reason, we should not just focus on the meaning of individual words, and we certainly should not focus on the etymology in particular to know what a word means. That's a fallacious way to study the Bible. A related idea to some of the things I just said is the confusion of words and concepts. So a lot of analysis of biblical languages tends to take a particular word and assign a concept to that word, and then take maybe if there's two different words that we would translate similarly, like different words for love is a really popular one that you'll hear about. People will take those words and say, this is what this kind of love means, and this is what this kind of love means, and then they'll draw some theological conclusion, which is usually highly unfounded. So the fact is, different words can express the same concept. If I was going to leave this room right now, I could say I'm going to exit the room, I could say I'm going to leave the room, I could say I'm going to go outside of the room, I could say I'm going to take a break, and some of those have different nuances and some of them don't. And so we need to appreciate that concepts are not the same thing as words. And not only can different words express the same concept, but the same word can express different concepts. So, if you look in a dictionary, you'll see oftentimes meaning 1, meaning 2, meaning 3, and oftentimes under those things, sub-meaning, 1.1 or something like that, 1.2. So a word, it's not just that one concept goes with one word. Multiple words can mean the same thing. The same word can mean multiple things, and so we need to be careful about just linking, okay, here's this word, here's what that word means religiously or something like that. People do this a lot in Christian preaching, and it's absolutely not justified in almost all cases. In the early 20th century, there was a very influential, very large lexicon published called the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. It was in German originally and then translated into English. If you are in a library that has theology books, this is about 10 really thick blue and purple volumes that will all be together in a reference section or something like that. Kittel is the editor, but lots and lots of scholars of that time contributed to this lexicon. And this lexicon does this thing I'm complaining about, where it associates the words with, it traces the development of religious ideas and attaches that with specific words in the New Testament. In the early 60s, James Barr famously wrote a book called The Semantics of Biblical Language, where he was highly critical of the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament and showed some of the problematic aspects of this approach. Specifically, one of those that he highlighted was the confusion of words and concepts, and showed how, again, there's different ways in which a word is used, different ways of expressing the same concept using different language, and so forth. So sort of the new school of thought, it's not that everyone thinks the same way now, but this more recent of the last few decades way of looking at words is reflected in the Lau and Nida lexicon. It's called the Greek-English Lexicon of the New Testament, based on semantic domains. This came out in 1989, so it's been a little while. But this book treats words differently by listing, it lists the words alphabetically, but then it also lists them by semantic domain. And so if you're talking about the word glory, or in Greek doxa, it will list doxa in several different places with other words that capture something similar to that meaning. So words that have to do with possession would be listed together, and it'll also be indexed alphabetically so you can find it. And this sort of tries to get at the fact that when we're studying a text, we don't just look at what a word means and bring that to bear on a specific sentence. We look at how is this word functioning in this sentence, in this discourse, in this broader conversation, or whatever else we're looking at. So, I think that Lau and Nida is included in Bible Works, and it's included in Logos. I'm not sure if TDNT, that earlier lexicon, is included in Bible Works, but I know that's in Logos as well. So you can have a look at those if you want to and see the difference in how they approach language. I would say I'm much more sympathetic to the Lau and Nida approach, and I think increasingly a lot of Bible scholars are. However, a lot of Christian preachers are not familiar with this discussion and assume that words and concepts go together. And so let it never be with you again. And then I wanted to say a couple other words about Greek and ministry, and just using Greek as Christians that aren't necessarily misconceptions, but just a few words to wrap up. So I think some people, when they preach, especially if they are maybe a little self-conscious about their level of education, feel the need to incorporate Greek into sermons just because it feels like that's the thing to do. Especially evangelical churches will do this. I think it is a mistake to incorporate Greek just for its own sake. I, as someone who has some proficiency in Greek, when I preach, I will very rarely use it in a sermon. I have done it before, but I really try to stay off that unless I have to. If I have a point I need to use the Greek to make, then I'll make it. But if I don't have to use the Greek, I won't. And I think there's a few reasons this is a good idea. Number one, because frankly, I'll tell you the truth, probably at least 90% of the time when I hear someone use Greek in a sermon, they make an error. Because most people who preach sermons just don't know Greek that well. And so they tend to make claims that are not justified, or they repeat something they read in a book, but they didn't quite catch it precisely, or the book oftentimes is wrong in the first place. And so if you're not very proficient in Greek, which requires years of practice, there's a decent chance you'll say something inaccurate. And even if you do, and as students of mine, hopefully you'll all be Greek superstars by the end of this course, but even if you do know Greek really, really well, and even if you are accurate, and I tend to assume that if I'm using it, I'm probably pretty accurate most of the time, more so than a lot of people, I'm still saying something that no one else in my congregation has the capacity to evaluate. If no one else knows Greek, then They can't say, well, what about this? I don't know if it's kind of like if I use the Greek, that's the nail in the coffin. That just settles the argument because I know Greek and they don't. And so, okay, I guess he must be right because he used Greek. And I don't think this is a good approach to preaching. I think we want there to be conversation. I think we want people to think for themselves. And so, yes, if I have to make a point using Greek, I will. But I try not to if I don't absolutely have to, because I want people to be able to work with and engage what I'm saying. I think that's probably an approach I assume most of us want to take to preaching. So I would encourage you, don't feel like you need to employ Greek in every sermon, and don't do it unless you absolutely must. That doesn't mean you shouldn't look at the Greek text in your own studies and in sermon preparation and in Bible study preparation. I absolutely encourage you to use the skills you're learning in this course to gain insight into the text, and that's why we're all here. But don't use Greek unnecessarily when you're talking to people who don't know it. And then the other thing I wanted to say real quick is about kind of the attitude we have as people who are learning in seminary and so forth. I don't know if you have found this yet. I found that when I went to seminary, I developed a real attitude of smugness when I went to church, because I'd hear a sermon and I'd think about all the things that, because I was starting to think critically about theology and the Bible and so forth, and oftentimes learning things that my pastors didn't know, it became easy to be very critical of sermons and other things people said at church, and I developed a very smug attitude, and I've seen that kind of smugness is actually very common among seminarians. And so I don't think that's a Christ-like attitude, and I think we should strive to, yes, occasionally there's room for critique, and I think it's a good thing if a church has avenues for open discussion and critique and conversation and so forth. I don't think preachers should be held in this lofty place where they're above reproach, but I do think we want to have an attitude of love, an attitude of graciousness, an attitude of humility, and we should appreciate what each other is bringing to the table, not be super critical. And you probably agree. So I guess I just wanted to say, be careful about being smug. Be careful about being overly judgmental. Just because I'm criticizing some things that preachers usually do, I'm doing that so that you will be that much better in your use of Greek. I'm not doing it so that you will be that much more judgmental of other people in your life who are using Greek or whatever, who are teaching sermons and things like that. So I want to encourage us to try and be Christ-like and humble and appreciative, and also recognize our own limitations, that we don't have it all figured out either. So I think that's important. Great, so I hope this was helpful, and that this can continue to shape us I hope this will shape how you think about what you're learning as we work through this course. Okay? Thanks.